Donald Trump and Xi Jinping finally spoke on the phone. As we discussed yesterday, Trump tweeted in the middle of the night that Xi Jinping was very tough and very difficult to make a deal with. However, just a few hours later, he had a phone call with Xi. What was the outcome? Trump said the call went well and he was very satisfied. China didn't explicitly say very satisfied, but Xinhua news agency published a very lengthy report. Given the intense US-China conflict, if both sides are satisfied and reached some consensus, it must mean one side made concessions. But where were these concessions made, and by whom? Let's examine the statements from Xinhua news agency and Trump's social media post to understand what might happen next in US-China relations. Xinhua news agency preemptively reported on the call on June 5th. As of now, I haven't seen an official White House statement, only Trump's social media post. Xinhua said that on June 5th, Xi Jinping held a phone call at Trump's request. At Trump's request implies Xi Jinping wasn't eager to speak with Trump, and Trump had been requesting it for a while. The report stated that both sides agreed to make good use of the established economic and trade consultation mechanisms, uphold an equal attitude, and respect each other. It then added that China has sincerity, but also principles, a subtle but firm message. Xinhua claimed that Chinese people honor their words and actions. It further stated that China has seriously and conscientiously implemented the agreement since the Geneva negotiations, and that the US should view the progress made objectively and revoke its negative measures against China. This explains why China suddenly reimposed restrictions on rare earth exports to the US. China believes that during the Geneva talks, the US took negative measures. What were these negative measures? As we discussed before, they included the prohibition of EDA software exports to China, restrictions on aviation parts and technology exports to China, and limits on ethane and other product exports to China. Ethane, a chemical product, is in high demand in China for plastic production. The US is currently the world's only supplier capable of transporting ethane by sea, and over half of its annual ethane exports go to China. However, Trump has now imposed restrictions on ethane exports. This is what China refers to as the negative measures taken by the US. After this seemingly successful call, what concessions might the US make regarding the previous restrictions on EDA, aviation parts, technology, and ethane exports? Personally, I believe ethane exports are the easiest for the US to concede. As for EDA or aviation technology, as we've said, if China wants critical, sensitive technology from the US, it's like asking a tiger for its skin. If the US gives this technology to China, China could surpass the US in semiconductor production and design, as well as in military aviation. This is absolutely unacceptable to the US. In Xinhua's report, Xi Jinping emphasized that the US should handle the Taiwan question prudently. Every US-China negotiation inevitably brings up the Taiwan issue, which is China's absolute red line. Xinhua's message to the outside was that Xi Jinping told Trump to prevent a very small number of Taiwan independence separatists from dragging the two countries into dangerous conflict and confrontation. This implicitly means China is willing to go to war with the US over the Taiwan Strait. Xinhua also reported that Trump expressed great respect for President Xi, stating that US-China relations are very important and that the US welcomes China's continued strong economic growth. Trump reportedly said that US-China cooperation can accomplish many things and that the US will continue to adhere to the One China policy. The interpretation of the One China policy differs between China and the US. As you know, the US acknowledges only One China, but it maintains that Taiwan is not part of it, which differs from China's stance, as seen in past State Department statements. Despite this, Trump reportedly said the Geneva economic and trade talks were successful and that the US is willing to work with China. The US also welcomes Chinese students to study in the United States. We know there's been much debate about visas for Chinese students studying in the US. I believe many in China have been misled by US left-wing media into thinking Trump wants to ban all Chinese students from studying in the US. This is incorrect. Trump's restrictions are on Chinese students studying in sensitive fields, or those affiliated with the Chinese Communist Party, and specifically those applying to certain institutions like Harvard. But for students in economics, literature, or law, Trump has said there's no issue. Xinhua reported that Xi Jinping invited Trump to visit China again, and Trump expressed sincere gratitude. Both heads of state agreed that their teams would continue to implement the Geneva Consensus and hold a new round of talks as soon as possible. Here's a major difference. Xinhua claimed Xi Jinping invited Trump, and Trump was eager. However, in Trump's own social media post, both sides extended invitations, and both agreed to visit each other's countries. This is a significant distinction. Let's look at Trump's social media statement. He said his call with Xi Jinping lasted about 1 hour and 30 minutes, and he believes it yielded very good results for both countries. How good? Trump said that the complexity of the rare earth products problem should now be without doubt, implying that, according to Trump's description, Xi Jinping has agreed that rare earth exports to the US will no longer be an issue. This suggests that American car factories will not face the risk of shutting down. Trump stated that our respective teams will meet at a soon-to-be-confirmed location in the near future. He mentioned the US representatives Stephen Mnuchin, Wilbur Ross, and Robert Lighthizer. The first US-China talks only involved Mnuchin, but now all three most important figures in the trade negotiation team will be present. Trump added, "President Xi invited me and the First Lady to visit China, and I reciprocated." This means Trump also invited Xi Jinping to visit the US. As heads of two great nations, we both look forward to these reciprocal visits. Who visits first is not specified by either. Trump also specifically emphasized that the conversation focused almost entirely on trade issues and did not discuss anything related to the Russia-Ukraine war or Iran. He concluded by saying, "We will announce the time and location of the talks soon and will explain it to the media at that time. Thank you for your attention to this matter." This is Trump's account. So, Xi Jinping and Trump had their phone call and both offered similar yet different descriptions. Who made concessions? First, I think it's largely safe to say that both sides made concessions. What are China's concessions? Trump clearly stated it. China's restrictions on rare earth exports to the US will be eased. Whether China will follow through remains to be seen. You can tell by observing Trump's upcoming tweets. What concessions did the US make to China? From China's perspective, the most important US concession, besides not supporting Taiwan independence, is how that support is defined. Not supporting Taiwan independence means acknowledging Taiwan as part of China, not selling weapons to Taiwan, and condemning Taiwan independence forces. In the history of US-China relations, this has happened before. For example, when former Taiwan President Chen Shui-bian proposed a referendum and one country on each side, the US State Department condemned him as a troublemaker. At that time, US-China relations were very good. China certainly hopes the Trump administration will do the same now. Furthermore, Ronald Reagan, known as the most anti-communist president and the driving force behind the Soviet Union's collapse, also signed the third US-China joint communique when he visited China. The contents of that communique terrified Washington and Guam because it clearly stated that the US would reduce its arms sales to Taiwan until they completely ceased. In that scenario, there would be no talk of a military unification war between Taiwan and China. China could occupy Taiwan at any time with its military superiority. However, after Reagan returned to Washington, he issued the 6 assurances to Taiwan, completely overturning the content of the third joint communique. So, China greatly hopes the US can make concessions on the Taiwan issue. Additionally, China desperately wants the US to ease restrictions on chip exports. Within the US, there are many industry insiders who cooperate with China on this, such as Jensen Huang of Nvidia. Huang is most eager for chips to be freely imported into China so he can make a fortune. As for US national security, Huang would say he doesn't know and it's not his concern. So, China's biggest desire is for the US to relax chip controls. These 2 points, I believe, are what China most wants the US to concede. What does the US want China to concede? In terms of immediate urgent matters, it's definitely rare earths. In the long run, the US wants significant concessions in negotiations, specifically regarding China's economic growth model. This is something Mnuchin has mentioned many times, and China has also repeatedly stated it won't discuss this topic. So, future US-China trade negotiations will still be fraught with conflict. Has Trump made concessions to China on the Taiwan issue? Let's look at another recent Xinhua report. Xinhua reported on the 5th that the Dian branch of the Guangzhou Public Security Bureau in China issued a wanted notice, publicly seeking 20 members of Taiwan's Information and Communications Electronic Force suspected of participating in illegal cyber attacks, accusing them of violations. CCTV then escalated the accusation, stating that the Democratic Progressive Party (DPP) authorities have long cooperated with U.S. intelligence agencies such as the National Security Agency (NSA) and the Central Intelligence Agency (CIA), actively assisting the U.S.'s Asia-Pacific strategy and attempting to achieve independence through cooperation with the U.S. At the very least, from this report, we see that the US is currently helping Taiwan launch cyber attacks against China. The US has always accused Chinese hackers of cyber attacks against the US and the world. So, the US is now using Taiwan as a platform to counterattack China. CCTV, citing unnamed informed sources, said that US intelligence agencies have repeatedly provided personnel training, technical equipment, and other support to Taiwan's cyber army, and have sent infiltration and hunting teams to Taiwan to conduct cyber attacks against mainland China. In short, the US is manipulating and supporting cyber attacks against China. This indicates that the US will absolutely not make any concessions to China on the Taiwan issue. If it were to concede, the US would not support Taiwan's cyber attacks against China. Another topic. The US has now publicly admitted to having US troops stationed in Taiwan. How many? Some guess 500, but others guess more. Why are 500 or more troops not the crucial point? Because China once drew a red line for Taiwan. Any US troops stationed in Taiwan would signal the start of a military unification war. So now, both Taiwan and the US are, explicitly or implicitly, even openly, telling mainland China, we now have US troops stationed here. For example, in past Hong Kong exercises, you would never see US troops in photos, but now public photos show US troops. So, based on what we currently observe, the US will not make concessions to China on the Taiwan issue. What about trade negotiations? Beyond bilateral negotiations, US negotiations with other countries are also crucial. Why? Because the trade agreements the US signs with these countries will include poison pill clauses targeting China. Let's look at what Wilbur Ross said when testifying before the Senate. He stated that the Trump administration would continue to pressure Vietnam as long as it continued to re-export large quantities of Chinese products to the US. A Bloomberg report quoted Ross responding to Senator John Kennedy's question, saying that Vietnam buys about $90 billion worth of products from China and then re-exports them to the US with an added markup. So, this is a channel from China to the US. Senator Kennedy then asked if the US would stop having this specific demand on Vietnam if Vietnam eliminated all tariffs and trade barriers on US imports. Ross said, "That would be a terrible deal." To emphasize that the US would not do this, Ross repeatedly said, "Absolutely not, absolutely not. That would be the most foolish thing we could do." Meaning, if Vietnam offered zero tariffs and zero trade barriers to the US, would the US stop demanding that Vietnam not transfer cheap industrial goods from China to the US? Ross said, "No, absolutely not. No conditions from Vietnam are more important than this one." Therefore, Reuters reported that the US has issued stern tariff negotiation demands to Vietnam, including a request to reduce reliance on Chinese materials and parts. So, regardless of what Trump and Xi Jinping discussed on the phone, whether China relaxes rare earth issues or the US relaxes ethane exports to China, the US's principles in overall trade negotiations have not changed at all. Let's take another example, Japan. Japan's trade delegation is about to come to the US for negotiations. Their representative, Toshihiro Nikai, stated that this is the fourth round of consultations, and they have generally grasped the US demands and will propose a joint response to China in these consultations. You see, the US is now completely open about telling you, I have reciprocal tariffs with all other countries. I will negotiate with these countries to see if we can eliminate reciprocal tariffs, depending on how you deal with China. Japan's general grasp of US demands primarily means ensuring that essential materials for industrial activities are excluded from China's supply chain. Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba and US President Trump held a phone call last month, and Trump directly asked Japan for cooperation in this area. To retaliate against US tariffs, China restricted rare earth exports in April. But what role will Japan play in the rare earth issue? Because Japan has strong technical capabilities in rare earth processing, recycling, and reducing usage. The first country to experience a rare earth conflict with China was not the US, but Japan, so Japan is already ahead in this regard. Therefore, the US wants to seek cooperation with Japan in this area. Japan is also considering increasing imports of US liquefied natural gas. Why? Because due to the US-China trade conflict, China has now stopped importing liquefied natural gas from the US. US traditional energy products are an area that Trump is particularly focused on. So Japan says, don't worry, I'll buy it. You see, going forward, whether it's US-Japan, US-EU, or US-India negotiations, poison pill clauses against China will be included. So, in Trump's negotiation principles with Xi Jinping, China must make concessions. I believe that Trump's phone call this time may have resulted in some concessions from Xi Jinping. I guess the most likely concession is on ethane exports to China. However, in future negotiations, the US will, as we see, continue to include poison pill clauses against China in trade negotiations with various countries. This means that the US's negotiation terms with China will not loosen in the future. That's all for our program time today. Thank you for watching. See you in our next program. Thank you for listening.